In this video, I am going to explain the effects of monetary policy into the economy, how the central banks actually behaving if the economy is away from ideal position. Okay, so we already noticed that if fiscal measures by the Treasury Department changes, the government can bring the economy back to the ideal state. There is alternative ways which the central bank can do the same. So without government is increasing or decreasing its fiscal measures, the central bank has a mandate to basically bring the economy to the ideal state of economy with unemployment rate to be equal to natural rate of unemployment and the inflation rate to be stabilized at certain levels. So this is basically called monetary policy. There is actually the old textbooks. Here we said that there is a nexus between three major variables. That's the price, interest rate, and the output. So these are working. We can no longer say that everything else remains the same. Once one of them change, the other one is going to change, and the other one is going to change, because the money market and goods market are so interlinked. So they are instantly interacting. And we have a problem of showing them all in one diagram. So we did it. If we draw the output here and interest rate here, we call this one ISLM. Actually, LM is being taken out. It's called monetary policy rule model. It's nowadays we are using this terminology, or the Fed rule. Or if we draw the Y against the price level, that is what we call it aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. All right, so this one for the fiscal policy, we already explained it. I'm sorry. Long run aggregate supply, potential level of output. With the relationship between interest rate and output, if you stay in the goods market and see the interaction of the interest rate and Y while the goods market is in equilibrium, we call it IS curve. IS curve, goods market is in equilibrium. And if we keep, so how does it work? I will explain it. It worked like this. The Keynesian model was the 45-degree line and aggregate expenditure. Okay. Now the interest rate, let's say, increase, then investment is going to be decreasing, and then the aggregate expenditure is going to be shift down, and then the Y is going to go down, or opposite. So we're going to have aggregate expenditure going down. And this can be done if there is an inflation. If inflation comes from here, after this inflation is changing the money market. So I draw the money market also in this side. Money demand. and money supply. Okay, so if in case the money demand because of inflation shifts to the right, interest rate will go up, and as a result of interest rate goes up, one component, which is I, C plus I will go down, and then this is going to be shifting lower, and then the Y is going to be going from Y0 to Y1. But both Y0 and Y1 is the intersection with 45-degree line. So it is the goods and services is in equilibrium. This has been shown here. If the interest rate was here, I0, Y0, now it is I1, higher but lower output. So this is goods and services are in equilibrium. Alternatively, in the olden textbooks, they were saying that how we can keep this if it is the relationship between Y and I. So how we can say that if the Y is increasing, then the money demand is shifting upward, and then the interest rate will go up. So it's like that a change in Y bring this to here, and then the higher I0, I1. So interaction between Y and I from the money market perspective is going to be like this, and that is that a combination of Y, so here is not Y, see here is money. So if Y change, what's going to happen to the interest rate? So this is positive relationship. See, this is increasing, this is increasing, the opposite, whereas here was the negative relationship. So the IS curve is downward sloping, whereas the they used to be called LM curve, liquidity money. It's showing combination of Y and I where the money market is in equilibrium. And this point is showing one point of the aggregate demand. So if this is Y star, it's Y star, the price is going to be P0. Okay, so this is one point of the equilibrium. So on aggregate demand, now if the price change, we are going to move from here to here to here. But both goods and services, so aggregate demand, both, because it's intersection of L and IS, so every point in aggregate demand is showing that both money market and goods markets are in equilibrium. That's why the understanding the aggregate demand is becomes so important. The sensitivity of P to the Y if both goods and money market are in simultaneous equilibrium. Okay, so this has been explained this way, but in the modern textbooks, including ours, we are not using this LM curve analysis. So this is IS curve analysis. Instead of LM curve, we have monetary policy rule curve. It's basically suggesting that the central bank is not following that rule. They have a rule, they are expert people, and they are determining the interest rate according to variation of the major variables. So it is the Y variable, price variable, and other variables. So it is suggesting that it's an alpha multiplied by this plus a beta multiplied by this plus a gamma multiplied by this. This is called monetary policy rule. okay? And they are measuring it empirically, and by the way, they are all positive. Empirical studies are showing that they are positive. It means that if the output goes up, central bank increases the I. If the price goes up, central bank increase the I. If the other factors, this is like beyond the anything else but Y and P, such as consumer confidence or autonomous consumption. Okay, etc. If those, it's called Z variable. Okay, so the relationship between I and Y is positive, and we can, if these are constant, the relationship between these two are positive. So instead of using the LM curve, they have replaced it with the monetary policy rule. But basically it is suggesting the same thing. If the Y change, how the targeted interest rate is going to be adjusted by the central bank so as money market is going to be in equilibrium. Having said that, if the central bank's monetary aggregates are M1 or money supply, they can affect this by targeting a certain interest rate. So they come every Wednesday or every week, the head of the Federal Reserve comes out and says that the targeted interest rate is announced by them. And then they have open market desk, which is dealing with buying and selling government bonds and control over interest. So in the olden way of explanation, it is like this, that if the central bank is deciding to increase the money supply to here, what's going to be working? Money demand is not changed. So the central bank is actually letting the target interest rate to interest rate goes down. And how do they do it? They basically by buying bonds, they pay cash, and the cash is money circulation. M1 starts increasing. Quite contrary, if they target a higher interest rate goes up. So they are reducing the money supply through the open market desk by selling bonds with higher interest rate. So they target a higher interest rate, and then by selling bonds, actually they encourage people to buy. And in order to encourage the people to buy those bonds, they have to increase their interest. And as a result, this is happening. So either using the old style, or it is affecting the either model. So if the central bank is increasing the money supply, actually the LM curve or monetary policy rule shifts to the right. And if it's increasing the interest rate, it means that they are reducing the money supply. So money supply increase, or targeted interest rate goes down, money supply shrinked or contractionary monetary policy, or interest rate higher, the MRP rule, monetary policy rule, is shifting to the left, or monetary policy rule is shifting to the right. So with the monetary policy, they can change, and then the intersection of this is showing that the new equilibrium with aggregate demand, if it is shift to the right, aggregate demand is going to be shifted to the right, and if the money supply is decreased, this may happen. So aggregate demand prime, aggregate demand double prime. So here the book is explaining, depending on the state of the economy, how the government can influence the economy through monetary policy. Unfortunately, if I want to show you in a cleaner graph, if the economy is in the flat side of the aggregate supply, if the economy is here, aggregate demand, you may think that let's pump the money to the society, but it may not happen as easily as you may think. However, if the economy is in this side of the economy, it is easier for the central bank to shift the aggregate demand down. So let's call it this 0, 1, 2. This is easy to be done. This is hard to be. Some economists are using this metaphor that the monetary policy is, unlike fiscal policy, which are effectively, it's like you have a stick and then you put next to this and then push it. Because it is stick, it can bring it to the right, 83, 84. So with a solid stick, it is easy to be done if you are in the flatter side of the short-run aggregate supply. But because it's a stick, it is difficult to pull it back. It is, and it's painful also. It's painful so increase of the government spending and decrease of the tax. Decrease of the tax or net tax are easily bring the economy out of the recession. Whereas the monetary policy are not going to work effectively if we are in the flatter side of the aggregate supply. You may theoretically you think that, well, let's shift the aggregate demand. It means let's increase the money supply to the up, and then Y is going to be increased. But there is a limitation if you are in this side, and this is when the economy has hit the zero interest rate. So once economy, then increase of the money supply is not going to help. The reason is the following, that if we have money supply here, okay, but the money demand is like this. This is the money demand. So already interest rate is 0%. Even if you increase the money supply, how it's going to be boost? The reason that it may have boost, if you bring the interest rate down, then investment is going to be increased, and then the aggregate expenditure is shift. But if it is already 0%, and how it's going to be affected? So they say the monetary policy is, instead of like being a very solid stick to push or force, it's like a rubber band. And the rubber band, it is good for pulling from the upper side to the left, and that is when the economy is basically, money supply is decreasing. So by increasing the interest rate, the money is going to be collected from the society. People find it easier to buy bonds and get some extra earning. Whereas here is known, in the very old books were writing as liquidity trap. Liquidity trap. There's so much money in the society, and interest rate is so low that this monies are not gonna help the economy, are not gonna boost the economy to bring it up, because if the interest rate is so low, it is the money supply is become ineffective. So that is what has been explained in the remainder of the book, is saying that, well, Z factor, such as consumer confidence, is able to shift the aggregate demand to the right or to the left, and monetary policy is let me also give the alternative names for the monetary policy here. Expansionary monetary policy is also called easing monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy is called tight monetary policy. So these are also very common expressions used, and it is being used actually in the slides as well. So when we say aggregate demand, if it's going to be shift to the left, it is contractionary or tightening monetary policy. Tightening monetary policy is happening once we have too much of consumer confidence. The central bank should impose tightening monetary policy. It means that there are too much money out there. They have to remove it from the circulation. A monetary policy that forms the Z has the same issues as the fiscal policy, from changing of the G, and so it has a similar effect at high inflation. Tight monetary policy is very effective one. Special cases, and that notion of the zero interest rate case is explained that depends on the elasticity of the IS curve and LM curve, or monetary policy rule curve. If the LM curve, we are talking about the influence of the central bank to change the interest rate and the Y, okay? The LM curve or monetary policy rule is got such a shape. So in the flat side, it is the IS curve which may create. If you shift the LM curve, it's going to be basically sliding on it to at a vertical side. It's going to be effective, be towards the left or towards the if it's positively sloped, monetary policy is very effective. So in the vertical side of the older LM curve or the Fed rule curve. So this has been explained by those alpha, beta, and if the alpha is very small, the alpha is the one which is affecting the Y, is too small relative to the beta, which is due to the inflation, then there's strong preferences to stable prices relative to the output. So the prices will be very low. So this is corresponding to the alternative model we have is the price. So it is corresponding, this part is exactly corresponding to the flat side of the short-run aggregate supply. So here the aggregate demand, actually it is suggested that aggregate demand curve is entirely vertical. It's entirely vertical. If it is very flat, the aggregate demand becomes vertical. So it is fiscal policy will work. The monetary policy is not shifting this aggregate demand whatsoever. So aggregate demand is going to be flat as Fed is willing to accept the changes in the Y to keep the prices stable. Oh, sorry, I was telling about the other case. So its aggregate demand is very flat. This is where the effective monetary policy can take place. Actually, it is in this side. Aggregate demand very flat. So change in this will bring the inflation very significantly down. But the alternative one is the zero interest bound or binding situation. This is the liquidity trap in the economy. It's a condition of the economy such that Fed wants a negative interest rate. Fed wants negative interest rate, but negative interest rate, how you can basically say, buy my bond and pay me something. It has to be, the nominal interest rate cannot practically go negative. It is through the inflation which the holder of the bond actually suffer, and their real interest rate becomes negative. So this binding situation is making the monetary policy, it cannot go below. The central banks wants to bring it to the negative so as the holder of the bond become debtful to the government, but it is the binding situation. So in the aftermath of 2008 recession, we reached to this position. It rarely happens, but in Japan's economy also facing the similar situation. This is the flat side of the LM curve or the federal rule. This is explained. We explained this IS curve, which is going to be shifted by the fiscal policy, are going to be more effective of changing this. But if the money interest rate is already trapped into this zero, shifting the money supply, or it's going to be sliding over it. This is going to be sliding over it. So it's not going to affect the Y at all. So the monetary policy rule in this situation, interest alpha y plus beta p plus gamma z, in fact this is too little, okay, as compared to the beta and gamma. This is too little. So if it reached to the 0%, then and it goes a very fraction, like it is 0, 0, 0, 1, then they change it to 0, 0, 0, maybe 5, something like this. So this is not gonna be affecting shifting. Even if it's shifted, it's not going to be effectively influence the aggregate demand function. So aggregate demand is remaining at certain level, So in the binding situation, that is what I want to say. In the liquidity trap, or is in the binding binding situation, the aggregate demand is not going to so what would be the solution? Actually, it depends on the aggregate supply. If the aggregate supply, wherever the aggregate supply is, so what is this the long run aggregate supply also? What if long run aggregate supply is here? Long run aggregate supply is here. So the monetary policy is unable to bring the economy to hit. And what if it's actually exactly here? Long run aggregate supply is here. So what would be the price level? We don't know. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So there's so many. So this is where the model is collapsing. Actually, that this is the model is unable to give us a clear solution. It's like in physics, singularity happens, where the equations of general relativity theory doesn't work. So yeah, that's actually explaining the monetary policy. Then we can explain another thing with. So if so far what we have got from our model, we learned that the aggregate demand may be shifted by the consumer, private sector, shift to the low or up, okay? And the government sector, be it central bank or fiscal policy, the government can come to help. So the short-run aggregate supply and stating where is our potential level of output. If exogenous factors change, economy may go to a recession or to expansion, but there is a solution, not very straightforward, but at least we know that at certain stage, at this part, fiscal policies are very effective. At this part, the monetary policy are very effective. And if you want to, the government wants to have both of them, it has to have a very strong team of monetary policy makers and fiscal policy makers. So far, we only focused on the shifts of the demand, aggregate demand. To here, to here, to here, to here. We didn't discuss the shift of the aggregate supply. But in the previous chapter, we said that aggregate supply may also shift. Imagine that economy, which is the US economy, is got affected not only by the labor and the capital, but also by the resources such as oil prices. Consuming oil economies like OECD economy or IEA economy are mostly oil consuming countries. OPEC, on the other hand, is oil exporting. So oil importing economy, if the oil prices are increased suddenly, like in what happened in 1973 and 1979, this was the Arab-Israeli war, Yom Kippur war, and this was the Islamic revolution in Iran. In either of them, the supply, the short run aggregate supply is shifted to the left. And this phenomena is explained well with the model which we have. By the way, before I tell this, if the economy is getting stronger demand, then we know that inflation is coming, right? This is called demand pool inflation. It means that the price of goods and services, remember this is the output markets, the prices are increased because of stronger demand. Aggregate demand shifts to the up. But in the 1970s, something very interesting happened. And that was the following, that due to aggregate supply 0 and aggregate demand 0. So we were in equilibrium Y0 and P0. But what happened? Due to oil prices, price of oil went up, aggregate supply shifted to the left. And guess what happened? Two problems at the same time. P1, Y1. Okay? So P1, Y1. In the first model, if we are either in the inflation or we are in the recession. We are either in expansion of the economy or in the contraction of the economy. But guess what happened in the aftermath of oil shock? See, we are in a recession. Another name of the recession is called Stag Nation. It's because economies get stagnated. It's become slowed down, okay? Slowed down. And also we have inflation. So two problems at a time. If the aggregate demand is only shifting to the right, we are going to have demand pool inflation. But this is called cost push inflation. Because these are more expensive, ultimately everything is going to be more expensive. Energy is a very key factor in the economy. So it passes from cost push, because the cost of production is increased, the inflation have gone up. So this is also known as cost push inflation. So if like its economy is like a wagon of a train, it's been pushed from the back, or is it been pulled from the demand? The previous cases, the Keynesians were explaining inflation as a pooling due to stronger demand. But now we have a case of that due to more expensive supply, then inflation is happening. And another thing, that two problems at the same time. So we have stagnation plus inflation, coexistence of inflation and recession at the same time. So the new word came, you can remove up to here and up to here, and you say stagflation. This was a new terminology which came in the early 1980s. Most European countries and the American economy faced this situation, which they were in a stagnation and inflation at the same time, so it's stagflation. So stagflation is simultaneous increase in unemployment and inflation rate, two problems at a time. And resolving this, let's say that the Y0 was the ideal one, long run aggregate supply. So if the monetary policy or fiscal policy in particular has been imposed, the aggregate demand is going to be shifted to the right, and then we're gonna solve one problem but add to the other problem. But they say it's fine because ultimately it's gonna be sustained at P2. But if it's not sustained and it becomes like a Tom and Jerry running around each other, then it may actually become a spiraling inflation and keep continuing going up and up. And that is not a good solution. Alternatively, some economists came and said that let's do something to bring this back to its, these are called supply side economists, supply side economic policies, and one of which was the Laffer suggestion, is known as the Laffer curve, saying that let's deregulate economy, deregulate, and give tax exemption to big businesses. If we give them tax exemptions, then the aggregate supply is going to come back, and then inflation is going to be resolved, and also two problems at the same. But this was the theory. This was the theory, and during the Ronald Reagan, a Hollywood actor who became the president. So we have all sorts of understanding of the economy if you have the model of aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So this is basically representation of the stagflation or adverse cost shock or cost push inflation or stagflation. Cost push inflation is coincided with stagflation. There is demand pull, or I already explained it, demand pull inflation. It is only the Keynesian side when the aggregate demand is shifting to the right and it's creating inflation. And addressing the demand pull inflation with managing the aggregate demand is easier than the supply shock. And I think the rest of the chapter is, you can read it, of the cases in the United States, that is not going to be our main major concern. So this chapter 12 is also covered. I wish you all the best. Thank you.